right, and next I have ERI International Director Rick LaValla. He, again, yes, thank you for sponsoring coffee and donuts. If you missed that, we've got them in the back corner of the room. Rick is also a former Washington State SAR coordinator, a NASAR past president, a SAR historian who never let the facts ruin a good story, and has participated in the evolution of SAR management training programs, such as the one sponsored by ERI. You do have to use that.
Thank you, Amy, for that kind introduction. Well, I'd like to say a few words about the history of the symposium and recognize the memory of the founder, Chris Long, and Chris's successor. And thank you very much. And a lot of you that knew Chris, he passed now almost 2 years ago. But he had a vision, and we're going back to 1996 in conjunction with the NASAR conference. And Chris said, you know, we ought to start getting people together to do this, foster the intellectual and scientific development of search and rescue methods and techniques to promote new ideas and to encourage the development of new techniques in the practical use of technology. So we had this broad stroke vision. He and I are talking, and he says, but I need a name for the symposium. And I said, well, you could name it after Rick LaValla or Skip Huxtable or Bill Wade. And I said, no, in all seriousness, let's name it after Bill Syrotuck. And he says, that's a great idea. So it was born. If my math is right, since 1996, we had 7 additional symposiums spread over time. We did them in, obviously, United States, Canada, and Iceland. If my math is right, this is the 9th symposium since 1996. I believe I got that right. So then, who was Bill Syrotuck? We've heard the name, right? Okay. Who was he? And why should we name a symposium after him? Bill Syrotuck emerged in the search and rescue scene in Washington State in the 1960s and 70s, late 60s and early 70s. Bill was an early innovator, particularly in the matters of dealing with search management and planning, the training and application of search and rescue dogs, search dogs. And he also experimented with falcons. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And the use of search theory. So Bill was about all these kinds of things back in that date. It was late 1971, I was hired to be the assistant state search and rescue coordinator, working for Hal Foss, who was the founder of NASARC, and then ultimately morphed into NASAR. So the principles of land search planning and search and rescue management back then were definitely lacking. Hal Foss recognized a need for perhaps some training that would be in parallel with, the National Search and Rescue School, Coast Guard does, Air Force. Civil Air Patrol had their mission coordinator schools. So he says to me, I think we have a need. Why don't you look into it? So I'm young, didn't know where to start really. So I call up Bill Syrotuck. And he was promoting the ideas of land search planning and management and all of that. And so we started dialogue. And he was stating that you could take different principles, search theory, lost person behavior. You could take a lot of things along that line, and you could probably get people in a room and pass on some information, and they would be better off on the other end as far as search management, search planning. So we connected up, and at the same time, there was a lot of other people involved with bits and pieces, and Bill Wade's going to talk about that in a minute. So what about Bill, the person, Bill Syrotuck? And so those of us that knew him, he interesting person. He became a very good friend, but he had a certain air about him. And some people back in the day would say, well, he's kind of arrogant because he'd get up and talk about all this research and different things. And I said, well, I'm not sure that that's the right word. I think it was kind of self-confidence in the fact that he really believed that a lot of these things could make a quality difference. This is interesting. So Bill was a Canadian living in Washington State. He married a gal who was heavily involved in hypothermia research at the University of Washington. And they and their search dogs were deployed often around the country through the U.S. coordination centers, the Air Force. And that gave him a platform, if you will, to kind of look around the country and see how things were happening or not happening. He was some sort of an enigma, as I think about it. And I keep asking, what was his background? Those that knew him, where'd he come from? Why was he living in the United States? I got to know him very well, and so late at night over an adult beverage or whatnot, I'd say, well, Bill, you're Canadian, where did you grow up? And he would just stare off and he'd go, let me tell you about when I started experimenting with falcons. And you'd never answer the question. I'd say, oh, so you got all this education, apparently. You have degrees. You know about the search theory and other. He'd go, and so I got falcons. And he says, I kept thinking that, and this is before we had drones, obviously. He said, I keep thinking that falcons would be a great tool to finding lost people. And I'd say, so where'd you go to high school? He'd say, so I got the falcons and I started training them to fly over areas. And when they spotted a person, they would do a flip. Okay, so he's out there working with falcons, and I'd say, so what'd you do in Canada for the last 20 years of your life? And he'd say, so the falcons, he says, I did that. He says, I got them so they would see people out there and they'd do the flips. And he says, the problem was, can you imagine if you go over a particular recreational search area, how many people are out there? And he says, these falcons were going, and then they'd crash into trees, and he says, they gave up on that. So at any rate, after Bill passed in 1976, we had a funeral and memorial. This guy shows up, and he comes up and he says, I'd like to say a few words about Bill Syrotuck. We said, yeah, okay, yeah, say a few words. And he talked for a couple of minutes, and the hint was that Bill was heavily involved in the Canada Security Intelligence Agency or anything else along those lines from, 50s, 60s. So that's all we know about him. And I keep asking people that knew him quite well, what else do we know about him? He had falcons. So at any rate, who was Bill? He was, I guess, the spark, if you will. A lot of people would probably agree. He was the spark that just started so many things rolling back in the day for all the matters that we're here to discuss. So, yeah, I don't know much else about him. He was a friend, mentor. And so at that point, knowing more about the history, we're going to learn more about the history from Bill Wade.